So have you ever wondered why no matter what camera you use, you just can't quite get the image to turn out the way you want it to turn out? If that's you, you are in luck because today I'm going to explain how to get the proper exposure right for every shot. Now, mind you, there is a lot that goes into exposing the scene, everything from the lighting scenario you're in to the look that you're actually trying to achieve. But by watching this video, I'm going to give you the basics on how to set your exposure so no matter what situation you're in, you're going to be able to get the look and shot that you want to get. So without any further delay, I'm going to get right into it. So when setting your exposure in camera, there are going to be 3 settings that you're going to have to make sure you know how to set them correctly. They're going to be your ISO or ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speed. And even though these settings are separate and apart from each other, they have to be set in conjunction with each other to expose an image properly. So I'm gonna start by explaining shutter speed because I feel like that is the easiest one to understand. So pretty much what your shutter speed does is it controls the exposure of each frame, directly affecting your motion blur and really your image clarity. Depending on which frame rate you are recording in is going to determine what you want to have your shutter speed set at. Now there's a thing that people refer to as the 180-degree rule, which states that your shutter speed should always be set to 2 times your frame rate. So we know that the 3 basic frame rates that we mostly record in is 24 frames a second, 30 frames a second, and 60 frames a second. So if we're following the 180-degree rule, we know that if we're recording in 24 frames a second, we want our shutter speed at 1/48 of a second, but most cameras do not have 1/48 of a second, they have 1/50. So if you're recording in 24 frames a second, set your shutter speed to 1/50th of a second. If you're recording at 30 frames a second, set your shutter speed to 1/60th of a second. And if you are recording at 60 frames a second, you should only be using 60 frames a second if you're doing slow motion. And you definitely want to make sure that you have your shutter speed set twice that, which is 125 frames a second. Most cameras, well, I've never seen a camera that did 120. They do 125th of a second. And the reason that you want to make sure you have it at 125th of a second if you plan on slowing your footage down is it's not going to play back properly if you try to slow it down and your shutter speed wasn't set to at least 125th frames a second. And like I said, if the shutter speed was set properly, you will get the proper motion blur to coincide with slow motion footage. And also too, the higher that your shutter speed goes, it actually does make your image darker. So that is something that you want to keep in mind. But you do know if you're recording in the standard 24 frames a second, just set your camera to 1/50th of a second, and then what you see is what you get as far as the lighting. As it pertains to shutter speed, you're not gonna have to worry about that changing. So now that we know how to set our shutter speed, let's go over how to set our ISO. Now, ISO pretty much controls the light sensitivity or brightness of your image. Now, the lower your ISO is, the cleaner your image is gonna be, but also the darker your image is gonna be. So on most cameras, the lowest ISO is ISO 100. And on my camera, the usable ISO actually goes up to 12,800. Now, if you're recording in some sort of vlog profile, you wanna always make sure you're using your camera's base ISO, but I'm not really gonna get into that because that's a little bit more advanced. I'm gonna just assume that you're like a newbie and you're just trying to figure out how to control your ISOs. So like I said, the lower the ISO, the better. So since we know that we already have our camera set to 50 frames a second with our shutter speed, that's not gonna change. Let's assume we're recording in 24 frames a second. We have to set our ISO. Now, it really depends again on your scenario, your lighting situation, the look you're trying to get. If you're just trying to have a nice, balanced, clean lit image, like I said, your idea is to get the ISO as low as possible, because if you raise the ISO up high, or let me put it like this, the higher you raise your ISO, the more noise and grain gets introduced into the image. So the best way to keep your ISO as low as possible is to add in lights into your scene. If you're in a studio environment or an environment where you can control the lighting and you want to keep your ISO low, make sure that you add lighting to your scene so you don't have to jack up your ISO too much. And like I said, the idea is to stay as close to 100 as possible unless you are recording in log and your camera performs better at its base ISO. I'm recording on the Sony FX3. The base ISO of this camera is 640, so I'm at 640, which provides me the cleanest image. I just had to make sure that I added light, properly to my scene to make sure that I'm lit properly, recording at a 640 ISO. And there's nothing wrong with raising your ISO if you have to, but you have to balance it with your other camera settings to make sure it's not too high so you're not introducing any noise and grain into your image. So if you're in a real bright scenario, it's gonna be easier to bring your ISO down and closer to 100 for the cleanest image possible. If you are outdoors, you may need to get an ND filter so you can have your image become darker. But if you do find yourself in a lower light situation, you're gonna have to raise that ISO up so we can see what's going on. Now, sometimes you won't really know what to set your ISO to until you get through this next setting, which is your camera's aperture. Pretty much what your camera's aperture controls is the depth of field. Now, this is just a standard, YouTube setup right here. There's not nothing that I really want in focus back here. You see me, I'm the subject in the frame, and this is pretty much out of the frame. It's probably blurred a little bit. Maybe this flower might be in focus, but I say all that to say, I'm shooting at 2.8, and that is the maximum aperture of this lens. The lower the aperture number is, the more shallow the depth of field, the things behind your subject will be. The higher the aperture is, which I think this lens goes up to f22, the more in focus this entire scene would be. Now, aperture kind of works in reverse of the way that ISO works. The higher the number, like I said, f22, the darker my image will get. The lower the number, which this maximum aperture is 2.8, the wider the lens opens up to let more light in, the brighter the image will be. So f2.8 lets in more light, f22 lets in less light. Now, you really have to consider your scene. I'll give you an example. So I shoot a podcast in which has 4 people in a big old set that everything has to be in focus. So I have to shoot at least f8 or above, or some people are just gonna be blurred out. And I do shoot at actually f9, and I have my ISO set to my second base ISO on my camera, which is 12,800, which is letting in a ton of light. I record that at 30 frames a second. So my shutter speed is 1/60th of a second. And that's how I get this exposure that you're seeing on screen right now. In addition to, let's not forget about the lighting I had to add to make it look like that. Now, another thing you're gonna have to consider with your aperture is the plane in which the people in your frame are in. What I mean by that is I do a lot of weddings in which I want that shallow depth of field. I want my subjects in focus, and I want the things behind them blurred out. Now, if you're recording at 2.8 aperture and say you have 2 people who are face to face and they're kind of like on the same plane, meaning they're parallel with each other, they will both be in focus, and you'll have whatever scenery or area behind them out of focus. But if you ever find yourself recording where, say, one person is slightly in front of the other subject and the other subject is a little bit behind, or maybe you're recording at an angle, you probably will not get both people in focus. So that's another thing that you're gonna have to keep in mind with your aperture. Like I said, I do a lot of weddings, so when I'm recording like a side angle of a couple at an altar, I have to go to at least f4, because sometimes, depending on which side my camera is on, it will focus on that one person, either the bride and the groom, and the officiant and the bride, or the officiant and the groom will be slightly out of focus, and I really don't want that look. So whenever I'm using my camera off to the side and everybody's not parallel and they're not on the same plane, I make sure I set my aperture to at least f4.0 so everybody can kind of be in focus. To be honest with you, you will not learn how to get the proper exposure for scenes overnight. For me, it took a lot of practice, it took a lot of trial and error, and I'm not perfect now, but with what I know now, I'm definitely confident that I can get the proper exposure once I kind of assess my scene and then adjust my settings accordingly. If you are somebody who needs further understanding of camera exposure settings, go to my description down below and download my free beginner's guide of how to understand camera exposure settings. In that guide, you will find information on aperture, shutter speed, ISO, the exposure triangle, different frame rates. I actually give you suggestions on what to set your camera settings to in different scenarios. And like I said, that download is free, totally no charge to you. One favor I will ask you though is, if you did find some type of value in this video, go ahead and smash that like button. I would really appreciate it. Drop a comment or a question or a concern down below. I will answer you back, and I will catch you guys in my next video. Peace out.